Thanks everyone for coming out for this special edition of the Political Philosophy Workshop, a masterclass on Robert Paul Wolff's grand unified theory of Karl Marx's Das Kapital. I'm very excited to have Professor Wolff here to present his ideas. I first came across his ideas through this little but very meaty and pithy, if both things can be said about one book. Moneybags Must Be So Lucky, but he's the author of a number of fantastic books on everything from Kant and Rawls to anarchism to the idea of a university, as well as author of many entertaining and perceptive essays which have either been published or which are mostly filed on his website or at box.net. He is also author of a great blog, Philosopher's Stone, from which the pre-circulated material is sort of taken and condensed. He's going to speak for about half an hour-ish, or less, to present the ideas. Less given how many people are here.
Well, since they've all read what I circulated.
They've all read what he circulated, most of the books and everything that was in philosophy.
That's what I was told.
For the past 30 years. But yes, no, we're assuming people read it or are ready to comment on it. Before he starts, let's introduce ourselves to him. I'm Alex Gordovich from Political Science here at Brown University.
I'm Will Roberts. I'm from Political Science at McGill University.
My name is Kat. I'm a sophomore studying political science.
Peter Klein, Professor Emeritus, Worcester Polytechnic Institute.
A fellow, good show. Somebody from my generation, almost.
That's right.
Not quite, but
Almost.
I'm David Ahrens. I'm just a long-time blonde
good to
reader,
see you.
I read your book in 1971.
I'm Mark Ho. I'm a graduate student in the psychology department here.
Hi, I'm Amy. I'm a second year in sociology.
in sociology.
Carla Imatle, Political Theory Project.
Kevin McGravy, graduate student in political science.
Michal, graduate student, political science.
Ferris, I'm a graduate student in political science.
Ryan Emenaker, graduate student in political science.
Liza Williams, grad student in political science.
Thomas Moore, grad student in philosophy.
Paul Geyer in philosophy.
Good to see you, finally.
Corey Vetschneider, political science.
Rajiv, graduate student in political science.
Dave Escalade in philosophy.
I'm Valentina. I'm a visiting fellow in political science.
Sean, grad student in political science.
Thank you all.
Let me say, sorry, I forgot to mention one thing, which is this is being videotaped, and it will be made public via Brown's YouTube channel. So if anybody has an issue with that, please do let me know by the end of it so we can
Edit you out.
Edit you out in that old sort of, Trotsky's elbow way. Sorry.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. This is, for me, a very important moment because I realized when I was coming up here from the benighted South that I have now pulled off the hat trick. This is the last of the Ivy League universities for me to visit. I had visited all the others, but I had never before been to Brown in my entire life, so I can now put that to rest. And great accomplishment. I don't know that they remember me, but I've been to all 7. Karl Marx is the greatest social theorist who ever lived, and Volume 1 of Capital is the greatest work of social theory ever written. And the literature on it is an ocean that circles the globe. I have done no more than dip my toe into one little bit of that ocean. But despite my lack of knowledge of this vast literature, I am reasonably confident, I await contradiction, that my work on Marx is unique, quite literally unique. That is, I have never encountered anyone else who has even conceived of doing what I tried to do in my work, let alone tried to do it. Now, since that's a rather bold claim, I think I should start my remarks with a little story. 60 years ago, when I was a 22-year-old doctoral student in the philosophy department at Harvard, finishing up my dissertation, the Graduate Philosophy Club invited a retired professor from Michigan, Roy Wood Sellers, to visit and give a talk. You may not know the name Roy Wood Sellers, but some of you may know the name of his more famous son, Wilfrid Sellers. When Roy Wood showed up, we discovered that he was unimaginably old. He was, I think, 5 or 6 years younger than I am now. He gave a pathetic, plaintive, and rather sad talk, the gravamen of which was that his Midwestern version of causal realism had not received a fair hearing in the profession because the East Coast version of causal realism had dominated the journals. We all sat there in stunned silence, desperately trying to remember what causal realism was. I think it's fair to say that it was not a successful talk. And here I am, 60 years later, come to you from Chapel Hill to tell you that my version of Marx has not received a fair hearing because analytical Marxism has dominated the journals. I hope that those young people here in 50 years or so, when they tell this story, will be kind. I first read Capital in 1960 when I was preparing to teach a sophomore tutorial with Barrington Moore Jr. in the newly established social studies program at Harvard. But I read it quickly and I was not much impressed by it. I returned to it 16 years later when I decided to offer a graduate seminar at the University of Massachusetts in Classics of Critical Social Theory, and one of the 3 books that I assigned was Capital, Volume 1. This time when I read it, I was bowled over by it. I was stunned by it. I had never read anything remotely like it, I realized. And right then and there, I decided that I would spend as much time as it took to come to terms with it and wrest from it its core ideas, that I would, in the words of the Old Testament, wrestle with it all night and not let it go unless it bless me. I was going to read you passages from Capital to illustrate this extraordinary language, but since you've all read what I've circulated, you've read those passages. I know you haven't all read it, but I am forced to pretend that you have. This is, those of you who are young will learn that this is one of the conventions of the academic world. You have to put on your game face and pretend that you understand everything that's said to you, because that's part of what it is to be an academic, even if you've never studied it and haven't read it. And the better you do that, the sooner you'll get tenure, and you can then admit that you haven't a clue what they were talking about. But at any rate, the language was absolutely unlike any of the language used in any other work of social theory I had ever read. And by that point, I had read a great deal of social theory since I'd gotten a series of jobs in which I wasn't teaching philosophy. And so I had to read a lot of stuff that I otherwise would never read. The dominant theory regarding the strangeness of Marx's language is what I like to think of as the childhood polio explanation. This is the theory that when Marx was a young man, a particularly virulent strain of Hegelism was raging through the German-speaking world. And Marx caught a case of it and almost died. And he survived, but it left him crippled, so that he was barely able to make his way from the premises to the conclusion of an argument. And it would be simply unkind of us to expect him to tip-tap his way up a ratio-sonatio polysyllogistica like Fred Astaire ascending a flight of stairs. Joan Robinson, the doyenne of the British Marxists, had a rather simpler explanation. It was simply that he was German and therefore he couldn't write clearly. But I knew that that was false, because it turned out that several years before Marx published Volume 1 of Capital, he was at the first meeting of the First International, and he delivered a lengthy 2-part response to a speaker, a worker who had given an essentially Ricardian argument of some sort. Marx wrote this in English, and then he published it in English as a pamphlet called Value, Price, and Profit, which you can read to this day. If you read that pamphlet, you will discover that its language is indistinguishable from the language of Ricardo or Adam Smith. Well, Adam Smith was actually a stylist. Ricardo wrote rather spare language. Marx could write that way if he wanted to, but he chose not to. And I thought I had an intuition, an epiphany, an éclaircissement, if I can put it that way, of why Marx wrote that way. I decided that he wrote that way because he thought that only by writing that way could he capture the mystified structure of capitalist economic relations. And I decided that I would tackle this work, Capital, and come to a clear understanding of what was going on in it. It was clear that I had to do three different things. The first thing I had to do was to come to terms with the theory of mystification, with the philosophy in the book. But I was trained as a philosopher, and I figured, like Eliza Doolittle, that was mother's milk to me. I could handle that. The second problem was to come to terms with the language, and I'd never studied literary theory in my life, but fortunately, I was at that time, and had been for some long while, married to a very distinguished literary theorist named Cynthia Griffin Wolff. And through years of discussion with her, of her work on Samuel Richardson, Edith Wharton, Emily Dickinson, and other writers, I had picked up, as it were, from pillow talk, a fair amount of literary theory, so I figured I could handle that. The third problem, the hardest, was to come to terms with the economic theory. Now, at that time, in the 70s and early 80s, a number of very brilliant mathematical economists around the world were undertaking a reinterpretation of the classical tradition in political economy, the tradition of the physiocrats of Adam Smith, of David Ricardo, and of Karl Marx. Now, and what they discovered, casting these gentlemen's theories in mathematical form, was that many of them turned out to be perfectly correct and could be given rigorous demonstration. Some of them were incorrect, that happens. But it was a substantial body of important theoretical material once it got put in the proper mathematical form. Now, as many of you know, calculus is the mathematics of choice for neoclassical economics. But for reasons which I can explain during the discussion if anybody's interested, the classical political economists approached the economy in a quite different way that required not the use of calculus, but the use of linear algebra. And as it happened, I had never studied linear algebra. So before I could read all of these books, I had to learn some linear algebra. Well, fortunately, I had a sabbatical in the spring of 1978, one of the rare moments when I took off from teaching. So as soon as my fall grades were submitted, I bought myself a linear algebra textbook and spent the month of January teaching myself linear algebra. And then I got started reading all of these books. But the central idea that I saw in Marx required me to do something a very great deal more difficult than simply dealing with the literary aspects and the philosophical aspects and the mathematical aspects. What I needed to do was to find some way to bring these together in a unified way. Now, a great many people had talked about the language of capital. It was so astonishing that one had to pay attention to it. Edmund Wilson, the famous old literary critic, in his work To the Finland Station, actually described Marx as one of the great ironists of Western literature in the same category as Jonathan Swift. And of course, there was a vast literature on the philosophy full of the word dialectical, a lot, and inversion and mystification and false consciousness and other words even harder to understand than that. And then there was this mathematical literature, but there was nobody at all who tried to bring it together. And I realized that what I needed to do was to come to a deep understanding of all three of these and then unite them, find some way, if I can put it this way, to introduce the irony and the mystification into the equations. Now, nobody had ever conceived of such an enterprise that I can find. And certainly, if I had suggested, well, I did at one point suggest that I was going to write a big book doing this, and my colleague, now sadly deceased, Bob Ackerman, said to me, he said, "Bob, there's not a big market for a book that's half literary criticism and half mathematics." So I decided I'd write a trilogy. seemed like a good thing to do. And, you know, although I hate Hegel, I was enough influenced to think that I would have a thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, or something like that. So I would write a book on the literary aspects of Das Kapital and the philosophical aspects. That's Moneybags Must Be So Lucky. And then I would write a book on the mathematical aspects. That would be Understanding Marx. And I wrote both of those and published them. And then I would write a third book in which I united the two. But by the time I published Moneybags in 1988, we were in a bad era. We were in Reagan times, and nobody was interested in Marx anymore. The book, in David Hume's pathetic and famous statement, fell stillborn from the presses. Hume said that about the Treatise of Human Nature, which is far and away the greatest work of philosophy ever written in English. And one of my many fantasies is going back in time and telling David Hume, it's all right, we know how great a work it is. That goes along with my fantasy of going back to the court of Emperor Joseph and telling him the only reason we remember him is because Mozart over there was in your court. But that's a separate matter. At any rate, so I knew I could handle that, but I didn't know how I could bring it all together. And so I set to work, but I never wrote the third volume. I transferred to an Afro-American Studies department and spent 16 wonderful years as a professor of Afro-American Studies, heading up only the second PhD program in Afro-American Studies in the world. And that was an experience all by itself, about which I've written another book, but that's a separate matter. And so this 25,000 word summary, which is simply a brief summary of the work I've done, was my effort to bring all of it together and to explain how it connects up. And that's what I hope we can talk about today. Now, I'm trying to figure out how I can talk fast enough to go through the logical structure of the argument to a point where I can explain what I tried to do. Because even though you've read all of this, I know you haven't read it all. And so I don't know quite how to handle that. The problem, to skate over the top, the problem is this. Adam Smith and David Ricardo put forward a theory of equilibrium prices, or natural prices, as Adam Smith called them, which said that the prices were determined by the amount of labor it took to produce commodities. Adam Smith said the amount of direct labor. Ricardo developed that more fully by saying it was the amount of labor directly or indirectly required. This is what is called a labor theory of natural price, or in the language of the 18th and 19th century, a labor theory of value. But Ricardo knew that that theory was not generally true, a fact that bugged him, and he spent the last years of his life unsuccessfully trying to figure out what to do about it. That theory works only in the special case in which there is what today we call equal capital intensity, what Marx called equal organic composition of capital in all lines of production. But in general, there isn't equal capital intensity. Some lines of production use a lot of capital and very little labor. Some use a lot of labor and very little capital. That causes prices to skew away from their labor values, so that the labor theory of value turns out not generally speaking to be true. And Ricardo knew that, but couldn't figure out what to do about it. Marx believed he had solved that problem, and it turns out that he almost did. He solved it for a very, very important set of cases, which we can talk about in the discussion if you're interested in exactly what happened. But Marx didn't choose to put that in volume 1 of Capital, which is kind of weird. He put it in volume 3 of Capital, which was written when volumes 2 and 3 and the Theories of Third Plus Value, which is volume 4, which is 3 volumes long, were all written when volume 1 was published in 1867. But everything except volume 1 wasn't published until after Marx's death in 1883. Instead, Marx wrote all of volume 1 on the basis of the assumption of the special case in which labor values are proportional to prices. Why did he do this? Because Marx saw a deeper problem that his predecessors had not understood. And the deeper problem, to put it simple-mindedly, was, why is there any profit at all? The problem is, if prices are proportional to labor values, if commodities exchange in proportion to the quantities of labor directly and indirectly required for their production, then capitalists in a competitive market buy their inputs at the market price, at their labor values. They sell the output at their market price, which is at their labor value. They take in labor either in the form of direct labor or in the form of embodied labor, as Ricardo called it. They combine it in the factory. They sell the output as commodities. They get back what they put in, but how do they make a profit out of that? That was the mystery that Marx saw they didn't have an answer to. And he thought he knew the answer. The answer was the distinction between labor power and labor. And Marx gave an elaborate argument designed to show that that distinction could explain where the profit came from. To put it simple-mindedly, the profit was simply the money version of the surplus labor performed by the workers in the market, in the factory. The workers were paid a fair wage. They were paid the value of their labor power. And the value of their labor power was whatever it took to reproduce their labor power. The people who produced the thread that was woven into cloth in the factory were paid for their thread. That meant they were paid money that was the equivalent of or proportional to the amount of labor it took directly or indirectly to produce the thread. Same thing with the workers. In order to reproduce their labor power, they had to have food, clothing, and shelter to work for another day. So they got a wage which enabled them to buy their food, clothing, and shelter. Suppose, for example, that it took 6 hours of labor somewhere in the system to produce the food, clothing, and shelter, directly or indirectly, that the workers had to consume for one day. But if the workers, then they got paid a wage equal, in effect, to the 6 hours of labor. But if they would work more than that, say if they would work 12 hours, which was a typical work day in Marx's day, then the extra 6 hours got embodied in the commodities produced in the factory. When the capitalist sold the commodities, he got a value equal to what the labor that was in the commodities, which meant he not only got what he had paid for his raw materials and for his labor, he got the surplus labor time put in by the workers, and that was his profit. And casting all of this in linear algebra form, you could demonstrate quite clearly that the amount of labor embodied in the physical surplus that the capitalist expropriated, and which he then converted into money by selling it, was exactly equal to the surplus labor extracted from the workers, and that was the secret of where profit came from. What is the name for extracting more from an input that is contained within it? The technical name for that is exploitation. So it turned out that capitalism rests on the exploitation of the working class. That was Marx's central proposition, and he demonstrated it in Capital, even though he didn't have any mathematics. He tried working out one elaborate example, and he got it wrong, but it doesn't matter because the thesis was correct. He was absolutely right about that. Well, once I had gotten clear about this by reading the mathematical reconstructions of Marx, I started staring at the equations, and something occurred to me that was very disturbing. I could see in the equation where the labor was, the direct labor. I could see in the equations where the embodied labor was, but I couldn't see any symbol in the equations for labor power. There wasn't anything for labor. Labor power didn't show up in the equations. All that showed up in the equations was labor and corn and iron in the simple models that I was using in my book, or generally inputs into production. So then I asked the question that I thought when I asked it had never been asked before. I'll tell you the sad story about that in a moment. I asked, how much corn directly and indirectly does it take to produce a bushel of corn, a pound of iron, and so forth? What are the corn values of all the commodities? Nobody had ever talked about corn values, but if you look at the equations, there's no reason why you can't ask that question. You just set up corn value equations. The corn inputs that are directly used are put in at their total value. A bushel of corn counts for a bushel. But the iron that's used only counts for the corn value of that much iron. And the labor that's used only counts for the corn value of that much labor. And then it turns out that everything that Marx said about labor values was also true about corn values. and was also true about iron values. It was true about the values of any commodities that we used in production. Now, there's one key question. How do you know that it takes less than a unit of corn to produce a unit of corn? How do you know that there's surplus corn value? And the mathematical answer turns out to be trivial. So long as there's a physical surplus anywhere in the economy of anything, it doesn't have to be a physical surplus of corn, it can be a physical surplus of anything. And so long as the economy reproduces itself, that is, it produces enough stuff to keep going for the next year with some physical surplus, it will turn out that the corn value of corn is less than a unit of corn, and therefore there is surplus corn value. And it turns out that the surplus that is produced in the economy, the corn value of that surplus, is exactly equal to the surplus corn value extracted from the direct corn inputs. In other words, all the things that Marx had shown about labor were true about corn or iron or any other commodity, even though there's no such thing as a distinction between corn and corn power or iron and iron power. Now, there are two possible responses to this. I said that I discovered this. It's the only thing I've ever proved in my whole life, and I was enormously proud of myself. And I published it. Then John Romer, a very brilliant American mathematical economist who's a Marxist, in a response to my article, pointed out that somebody named Josep Vergara had shown this in a Spanish book 2 years earlier. Crap. So I was the second person in the world to think about this. That's pretty good, given how many people there are in the world, but it isn't nearly as good as being the first person in the world to think of it. So all I can do is offer a simplified proof of Vergara's theorem, which doesn't sound quite the same as saying Wolff's theorem, but there it is. I mean, now, is any of you a philosophy graduate student? I think one of you is, or is a yes. I have good news for you. If you write a doctoral dissertation in which you assert a certain proposition, and then discover that somebody has said it before you, you're okay. All you have to do is put a not sign in front of the entire thing, put the whole book in parentheses, put a not sign in front of it and publish it. It'll be just as good. In economics, not so, but I mean, it happened to my sister. She did a doctoral dissertation in biochemistry, did a whole series of experiments and discovered that there was no relationship between the two things she was studying, so that all of her charts were flat lines. She got the PhD, but it was not a publishable result because nobody was interested in the fact that there was no relation between these two things. It's better to be a philosopher than an economist. That's just one takeaway from this lecture. At any rate, there are two possible responses to Vergara's proof, which I reproved. One response is, oh, Marx is wrong. To hell with Marx, we'll go back to talking about Keynes. The other response, which was my response, is Marx is quite right. Capitalism does rest on the exploitation of the working class. He's just got the wrong mathematical model for modeling that fact. He actually knows exactly why capitalism rests on exploitation and how the exploitation comes about, but it isn't because there's a distinction between labor and labor power. It's because over a long historical process, which Marx talks about in great detail in Capital, workers are deprived of their control and ownership of the means of production, including their skills. Instead of owning their own tools and their own looms and all the other tools that they need for their work, those come to be owned by the capitalists who let the workers work at them. Even their skills, which it took them 7 apprentice years to master, get built into the machines so that a semi-skilled worker after a week or two can tend a machine, whereas in the olden days, it would take 7 years of work to get up the skill necessary to do that job oneself. So that over a period of time, a process of expropriation takes place in which the workers are deprived of their legal control over and possession of the means of production, and they have nothing left to sell but their labor. But, and this was the key to his analysis of capitalism, capitalism represents the workers as petty commodity producers who produce labor and who in the marketplace make a free bargain with capitalists in which they're not compelled to sell their labor, they're not compelled to deliver it up like serfs or like slaves. They can make a deal for a wage. They are free men and women. They sell their labor at a market price that is determined through competition in the marketplace. And then they deliver up what they have sold, just as somebody who sells a ton of coal has to deliver up the coal, and somebody who sells 100 bushels of corn has to deliver up the corn. They deliver it up by walking into the factory and working on the machines. They get paid a fair price because volume one of capital is based on the assumption that every commodity, including labor, exchanges at a value proportional to its labor value. They get paid a fair price. They have no complaints. They are free men and women. They are petty commodity producers, except that they and only they are in this peculiar position that the only capital they have is their bodies. Now I thought to myself, how, and so what you get is an ideology of capitalism, a mystification of capitalism that makes it appear as though workers are petty commodity producers, when in fact they are propertyless workers who have no choice but to sell their labor in the market, in the marketplace, and then to go into the factory and deliver that labor up to the capitalist. That's the only thing they can do. And so what I wanted to do was to find some way of constructing a system of equations that captured that anomalous, mystified character of labor in a capitalist economy. And that's what I did. I said, okay, let's treat the workers as capitalists. So there will be, in the equations, a line for the equation for corn, a line for the equation of iron, a line for the equation of labor. But because the workers have this unfortunate constraint on their ability to move their capital around. If you're in one line of industry and you are making less than the going rate of profit, you can cash in your capital and switch it to the line of production that is offering a higher rate of return. That has an effect. I mean, when you move out of corn into iron, less corn is produced. When less corn is produced, that raises a little bit the price of corn, which raises a little bit the profit rate in the corn industry. When you go into iron, you start producing iron, which is offering a higher rate of return. That increases the amount of iron that's available in the marketplace, which slightly reduces the price and therefore the profit rate of iron. And so, as Adam Smith says in this wonderful phrase, by the higgling and jiggling of the marketplace, a single economy-wide rate of return is established in the economy as a whole, except that the workers, if they want to cash in, they discover the workers, they're not fools. They realize they're not making the going rate of return on their capital. They're not making any rate of return at all. All they're making is enough to reproduce their commodity, labor, for the next day, but they're not making any profit on it. So they decide to cash in their capital and move into corn production or iron production. But their capital is their bodies. And the only way they can cash in their capital is by cashing it in, dying. They can't cash in their capital because their capital is their bodies. They're stuck. Therefore, their rate of return is not the going rate of return, pi, in the equations that I set up, which all the economists set up. It's a different rate of return, call it rho, which is not in general the same as pi and is in fact less than pi. I then did a little linear algebra in this article, A Critique and Reinterpretation of Marx's Labor Theory of Value. That's another thing to tell you, by the way. I published that article, which is wall-to-wall linear algebra, in a philosophy journal. Good luck to that. Nobody who could understand the linear algebra was reading the journal, and nobody who was reading the journal could understand the linear algebra. And so it fell stillborn from the presses, except for John Romer, God bless him, who reads philosophy journals, even though he's a brilliant mathematical economist. He wrote a response, but that was the long and the short of it. It has not caught on. But what I did was to demonstrate mathematically that the way in which prices shift because of the fact that in one line of production, you can't move your capital around to get the going rate of return, results in the fact that the workers pay a higher price for their inputs, their food, clothing, and shelter, than they should. And in a real capitalist economy of the sort that Marx was talking about, where there's almost no luxury consumption, except in my model for the fact that the capitalists read theology books, since I figured they were sort of Max Weber type capitalists. Aside from a little reading of theology books, they put all their money back into production. Accumulate, that is Moses and the prophets for the capitalists, says Marx. So as a result, since they're on a maximum growth path, there's not a lot of most of the consumption is done by the workers. Most of the end use consumption, not for reproduction, is done by the workers because they're most of the people in the economy. And the result is that they pay higher prices than they would be paying for their inputs if they were able to get the going rate of return on their product. And it turns out that how much money extra are they paying? Exactly the amount of money that the capitalists are appropriating as profit. I mean, intuitively that's obvious, but it's easy enough to prove mathematically. So what I produced was a system of equations that in some sense captured the truth of capitalism, but also captured the mystifications of capitalism by misrepresenting workers as petty commodity producers when in fact they are nothing of the sort. And this shows how the ideology of capitalism, in the form of the economic theories put forward by the economists, and then the justifications put forward by the philosophers and the theologians and the novelists and so forth, this ideological rationalization conceals the reality of capitalism, which is that capitalism rests on exploitation. That, in a very, very brief summary, was the vision I had when I started in 1976, and what I tried to capture in, see if I can do this now, all of these articles. And, whoops, I didn't mean that. Where's the up thing? There it is. This is the list in the thing that got handed out of all the books and articles I've published on this. There's one more called The Study of Society, which I wrote in response to a question from a woman who wrote into my blog, called herself somebody or other's mother. And she asked a question, so I wrote a 16,500 word answer over a period of days, which I called The Study of Society, which shows, and it's an important fact, that what Marx said about capitalism, this is a way in which I disagree with Marx, by the way, what Marx said about capitalism, which is that it is fundamentally and unavoidably mystified, it is ideologically encoded in mystified ways, is true of all societies. It's therefore true, if there ever were one, there never has been yet, it would be true of a socialist society. A sad fact, but I think a truth that has to be confronted. And if you add that to all of those, a lot of that is available at box.net. And since I know that all of you want nothing more than to spend your lives reading all the things I've written, something which I've never done myself, but which some of you might want to try, there's a good way to start. That's just a selection of about a 15th or 20th of what I've written. But, well, there's my sad story. I've come north from North Carolina to tell you, oh, if you want to know what's wrong with analytical Marxism, by the way, I've written that too. In an article called, it's on box.net, and it's the Jan Elster article. I wrote a review of a book that Elster wrote for the Canadian Journal of Philosophy, in which I devastated him, and devastated analytical Marxism as well. If you want to know what's wrong with all of this talk about the prisoner's dilemma and collective action problems and all the rest of that, you can read that article. But I'll stop there so I can take a drink of water and you can decide what you're going to do with this pile of turd that I've laid upon you. And there we go.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. I'll just keep a list of names and keep your hand up until I monitor you, so I'll monitor it. Oh, thanks.
Thank you, I enjoyed that. I did read the thing that you sent out.
Great.
But only once and really quickly.
Hey, that puts you in a very select group.
Well, I have a couple questions, but I think this is probably a starter question to kind of see how this works. So let's suppose the mystification we're going to concentrate on is the idea that the worker's labor is sold for its full labor value. That's not true, but the participants think it's true. And then something that's said in this article, and it resonates with things that get said, is that this is what capitalism needs people to believe. And what I want to know is just a little more about why we're supposed to think that. So something like capitalism's survival or non-disruption depends on people not knowing this thing that you just showed us. And one way to kind of frame the question is, which decision maker would decide differently if they were convinced by this, and why? It's not clear to me that anybody in the system, even if everybody now understands that labor is not sold for full labor value, would have any better options than what they're doing anyway. And why, so where would the disruption start, and why? Would it be rational? Yeah.
That's a very good question, and obviously I am under a certain obligation in answering any question to reference something that Marx said. So what I will reference is the last thesis on Feuerbach. Can anybody here quote the last, more or less quote the last thesis on Feuerbach? Anybody remember? Exactly so. Up till now, philosophers have only interpreted the world, but the point is to change it. Merely understanding the structure of capitalism is not going to change capitalism. It might cause you not to get published. In my case, it caused me to get tenure and promotion. I mean, the academic world in America has so thoroughly internalized Marcuse's theory of repressive desublimation that when they encounter somebody like me, they don't shriek in horror and say, "Fire that man, he's a danger." They say, "Thank you, Bob, you get a raise because you published." And then they forget what you said. So merely knowing the truth is not going to change anything. But there are two things I think that need to be said, one of which I say in this essay, and I'll repeat it, the other of which I don't say in the essay, but is more directly. First of all, it's important to understand the ways in which the distortions and mystifications which are characteristic of capitalism, both at the level of the workers and at the level of the capitalists, have a certain, as Marx himself says, social validity. So, for example, what happens over time is that the natural rhythms of work get replaced by the mechanical rhythms of work which are required for the production line, for the assembly line. Have you all seen, you're not old enough, but things are on YouTube and maybe you've seen it, the great old, my mind goes blank, but it'll come to me, the Lucy Ball episode with the candy factory, where she's working in a candy factory, and as these things come by, she has to put cherries on top, and it starts going a little too fast, and she's desperately trying to get the cherries on the candies before they get past her, and she can't. It's a magnificent version of Charlie Chaplin's old great movie Modern Times, in which he gets caught up in the machinery of a factory. Okay, well, what happens is, I mean, the normal rhythms of human work require times when you work intensely, when you're bringing in the harvest, say, and times in the winter when you're relaxed and if you're a fisherman, you're repairing your nets and so forth. There are times of different people have different rhythms. Some people work steadily, some people work in bursts. All of that has to be squelched in order to make a capitalist factory work, because in a capitalist factory with a production line, everybody has to work at the same mechanical, regular speed. That's an inhuman way to work, as Marx brilliantly understood long before he knew anything about factories in his early economic philosophic manuscripts of 1844, which he wrote when he was 26, after all. I mean, it's an astonishing fact. But I have to resist. Like Tristram Shandy, I have an almost unconquerable tendency to digress. And So I find myself wanting to talk about old movies and other things which illustrate these, but we don't have enough time for me to do all of that, so I will repress that tendency. At any rate, not only is it the case that the normal, humanly satisfying experience of work has to be transformed into this inhuman, mechanical kind of work in order to make capitalism profitable, but something else happens. The norms of such work have to be internalized so that the worker doesn't do it grudgingly, but actually is proud of himself or herself for being able to work that way. And everything in the society cooperates to support that bizarre, alienated distortion of human nature. So, first of all, you get and keep a job if you can work that way. If you don't work that way, you don't get or keep a job. Secondly, you are praised by your priest, by your family, by your children, by the factory owner for being a Stakhanovite, for being that kind of worker. And so the moment comes, as I say in this, it's a quotation. I'm now quoting something from this, which is a quotation from something else I wrote. When you get to be my age, you'll find you do that a lot. But at any rate, it gets to the point where the natural human resistance to the control of the production line is interpreted as a kind of mulish stubbornness. And the desire for more than enough to just sustain yourself is interpreted as a kind of self-indulgent luxuriousness, which has made its return in the present day in the talk in Republican circles about makers and takers, where the people who do the making are called takers and the people who do the taking are called makers, and anybody who wants a higher minimum wage is described as somebody who wants to sit in a hammock and rock back and forth while others give him money, whereas the people who sit in hammocks and rock back and forth while others give them money are called the masters of the universe, and they make gazillions of dollars. So that's part of the answer, but let me get to the other question. In order to change the world that we live in, it is necessary not only to understand what's going on, but then actually to do something about it. Now, let me give you a piece of wisdom that a student gave to me in 1969. 69? No, in the fall of 68. In the spring of 68, I was teaching at Columbia, and Columbia erupted. Some of you may have read about that, some of you may remember it. It was a moment. The students seized the administration building, and all hell broke loose, and the tactical police force stationed itself right outside the law school, which was 1 block north of where I lived, and 1 block, a half a block from the campus. And everything came to a screeching halt. It was a very exciting moment. And eventually there was a counter. They couldn't hold the commencement on where they usually hold it on the steps of Low Plaza because they were afraid of disruption. So they held it in a nearby church, and we held a counter commencement on the steps of Low Plaza. I mean, it was tremendously exciting. It didn't make a lot of difference, but it was tremendously exciting. At any rate, it so happens that the next fall I was giving lectures on ethics. And I was lecturing on Kant's ethical theory, which I was struggling with because I could not find in the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals an adequate and defensible argument for Kant's claim that the fundamental principle of morality could be demonstrated a priori. Turns out I couldn't find it because there is no such argument, but that's another matter, which I won't go into right now. Suffice it to say that I went on at great length about my inability to find that argument. And after class one day, a student whom I knew because he'd been very active in the student uprising, he was a communist and he was working with unions and he was a really committed kid, came up to me after class and he said, "Professor Wolff, why is it so important to you to find an argument to support the claim that the fundamental principle of morality is defensible by pure reason?" I said, "Well, if I can't find that argument, I won't know what to do." And he looked at me in the way that a parent will look at a not very smart but dear child. And he said to me, "First you have to decide which side you're on." then you'll be able to tell what you should do. Well, at the time, I thought it was a tremendous cop-out. Eventually, I realized it was the most important truth that had ever been uttered in my presence, since it is the foundation of all political action and all ethics. First you have to decide which side you're on. Who are your comrades and who are your enemies in the world? After you have found that, then you will face the strategic question, what shall you do? But first you must form a solidarity with your comrades. That is, just to digress, since I can't control myself, that's why I fell in love with South Africa the first time I went there. I went to South Africa for the first time in 1986, which was before apartheid was ended. And that was a country where everyone you met was immediately either your friend or your enemy. There was no in between. In America, you could know somebody for 20 years and have no idea what his or her politics were. But in South Africa, you knew immediately who your friends were and who your enemies were, and I loved that. But
can I come to the first part of your
yes.
answer? Because it looked like at the first part that the answer, my question was, why would anybody in this system act any differently if they were disabused of this mystification? And it sounded like you were saying something like, well, once the workers realize that their labor is not being sold for its full labor value, they'll realize they're being exploited. Isn't that terrible? But the economics doesn't show anything about justice. And it's arguable whether there's anything unfair about somebody getting a profit from there. So all they'll realize is, oh, that's where the profit comes from. And now they look at their options, and why wouldn't they just do the same thing they did before?
Because it's a much more complicated process than just an intellectual realization. The intellectual
they're not realizing they're being unfairly treated, they're just realizing how things work. That's where the profit comes from.
No, what they realize is that they are not being unfairly treated by the canons of bourgeois justice. But the canons of bourgeois justice are not interchangeable with the notions of justice per se. They are just the canons.
Right, so the argument would depend on some claim that this is unjust, and then they would see that.
No, it's not. This is an important fact about Marx, which is very important to understand. There was a game in the 19th century that people played. They sat around, they didn't have television, so they'd sit around their parlors and they'd take a list of questions. And everybody would answer the questions, and then they'd share them and see who answered what questions how. Who's your favorite novelist? What's your favorite musical composition? What is your favorite trait in men? What is your favorite trait in women? And we have two examples of Marx's filling these things out. They've been preserved in the papers. Marx's favorite trait in men was strength. His favorite trait in women was weakness. This is one of the many reasons why I decided not to write an intellectual biography of Marx, because I discovered when I learned a great deal about him that he was not a very nice person. But that's neither here nor there. Marx was not a moralist. He was not a moralist because he thought that moralizing was a form of weakness.
But if the argument doesn't go through, they would realize they're being treated unjustly. What disruption would there be by their realizing here's how economics works? How does that disrupt capitalism? That's what I'm not getting.
The realization by itself will not disrupt capitalism. The realization combined, first of all, with the misery they're suffering and their anger at that misery.
Before they knew anything about
but
surplus value.
Yes, but they knew the misery, but their priests and their teachers, and if they read philosophy, their philosophers were explaining to them that either there was nothing to be done about it and in the next world they would find happiness, or it was their fault. They weren't as good as the people who were making all the money because they had wasted their money on their food, clothing, and shelter instead of paring their cheese and collecting little bits of money and turning it into capital. They had Now, you may tell me that these ideological rationalizations have no effect on.
No, they just don't have anything to do with the fact that their labor hadn't been sold for its full labor.
No. That's part of the
argument. That's the mystification that's supposed to be really crucial to capitalism survival. Yeah,
that's part of the story.
Yeah.
You have to remember, not now, but in Marx's day, there were worker education classes, and workers spent time studying hard stuff. And one of the things that they studied when they were in unions was, my grandfather did. He never graduated from anything more than elementary school, but he spent his time learning this stuff as he worked in the socialist movement. And what he had to understand, not just that wages are too low and something needs to be done about that, he had to understand, he had both to understand what was going on and to be moved to do something about it, and through solidarity to other workers to assemble the force that was necessary to change it. And you needed all of that, because otherwise you might make the mistake of thinking that all we need is a minimum wage law to raise wages a little bit. And if we raise wages a little bit, then things will be better, and that will show that everything's okay. But if you really understand that all profit is the product of exploitation, that no profit is the result of the labor of the capitalists or the contribution of the capitalists. Nothing the capitalists do contributes to the production of goods and services except one thing. And here I do have to, what happened to my, good God, where's my briefcase? Here's my briefcase. I think I brought this with me. The answer to one of the answers to this question of what capitalists do can be found in an old Burt Reynolds movie I discovered. And so I will have, I know my mind works in strange ways, but what can I say? How many of you have ever seen the movie Stick, which was an old Burt Reynolds movie? Stick was let me see if I have it here. Yeah, here it is. Stick was an old 1985 version of an Elmore Leonard novel. Never mind the plot, which is very complicated. Burt Reynolds plays a car thief who spends time in the Florida State Pen, and when he comes out, he goes to Miami, and there a friend of his is ripped off, and he decides he's going to avenge his friend. But before he avenges his friend, he goes to see the big head of the mob in Miami. And Nestor, this guy, says, "Are you a foolish man, Stick?" "I used to be," says Burt Reynolds. "You don't think it foolish to come into my home? I have no quarrel with you." "Chucky, huh? And 5,000 you say he owes you." "He does owe me." "What do you want?" "Permission." "To what?" "To go after Chucky." "And how do you know to ask permission?" "I did some time in the joint. I did it well. I learned you always have to ask permission. Everything's the same, whether inside or out." It turns out that the only thing that capitalists do in the capitalist system, qua capitalists, not qua managers, not qua innovators, qua capitalists, the only thing the capitalists do is to give permission. They give permission to the workers to get access to the means of production. That's the only thing that capitalists do. And they get all of their profit just because the law and the military and the ideology and the religion and the philosophy and the economic theory all combine to say that they have a right to withhold permission unless they get their profit. That's the only thing capitalists do. They make no contribution at all to the actual production of a capitalist economy. All they do is give permission. And as Burt Reynolds says, I learned you always have to get permission. And it's the same outside or in, the pen. And that is, and that, but all of this taken together is required in order to build a movement which once, and it gets started just because wages are so low that people are miserable and they finally, I mean, as Marx says in the manifesto, the capitalists make the mistake of bringing the workers together into the factory where for the first time they meet one another and discover that they all are in the same fix and that they aren't the enemies of one another, which they think they are when they're in the marketplace competing for jobs. They are the allies of one another against the person who is making them miserable. Then little by little they develop a more elaborate organization, a more elaborate understanding of what's going on, a more elaborate theory of what needs to happen. Marx is only doing the theoretical part. Oh, he did some organization, but mostly he just did, as his mother said, God bless her, she said after a while, I wish Carl would write less about capital and make some. But
Let me bring in Will here, because we've got a few people.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, at this rate, well, it'll only take us till about 11 o'clock tonight to answer all the questions, right?
So this is actually going to dovetail nicely in some way, because in a late text, Marx, I think, denied exactly the position that you just took, in the sense that he denied that the capitalist doesn't add anything to production, in the sense that he said that the capitalist helps to produce the surplus that he then deducts from the workers. So I want to push on that a little bit, because I think I think that there are a lot of moving parts in your work, and as you said, there's a lot of complexity here. But I think there's one point where I really I think you have ignored a possibility. You said there were two possible responses to the fact that basically that there was no labor power distinction in the.
One is Marx is wrong, the other is he had it right with the wrong model.
Right. But it seems to me that there's a third possibility, namely that there's something wrong with the table. That, in other words, actually there is an ambiguity in the notion of labor inputs or labor outputs or units of labor. And that it's precisely that attention to that.
What's the ambiguity?
Well, I owe this argument to some extent to an essay by David Schweikert that he published in the Canadian Journal of Philosophy in 1989, where he argues against the Wolff thesis that actually there's a good reason to say that labor is exploited in a way that corn and iron are not, in that if the mode of production is, the technical mode of production is taken as a given, then any of the non-labor inputs, if the quantity is given of one of those inputs, then you know exactly how much of each of the other non-labor inputs you need, and you know exactly what your product output is going to be. But that's not true with labor. As I'm a capitalist, I go and I hire 5 workers to work in my factory. I don't know when I buy their labor power or when I hire them how much work I can get out of them in a day. Right? So that's the ambiguity in the labor input. Unlike corn, unlike iron, where what I buy is what I get, with labor, what I buy is not what I get. What I buy only brings the laborer under my power. And then it's a question of workplace governance, of how much I can get out of what it is that I bought. And it seems like that allows for a robust distinction between labor power, what you buy on the market, and labor, what you get out of what you buy on the market. And that might be a way of making this distinction in a non-question begging or non-metaphysical way. So I'm wondering what you think of that.
I need to be clear about it before I know what I think, because you say the capitalist brings the labor. Now, in point of fact, the capitalist knows exactly how much labor he expects to get from the workers when he brings them into the factory. He hires them to work 10 hours a day, let's say. Now, it is true, and Marx gives us detailed and wonderful descriptions of it, culled mostly from the factory inspector, the parliamentary factory inspectors' reports, of all of the sneaky ways in which capitalists attempt to extract more labor from the workers than they've contracted for. For example, by gimmicking the clocks so that they get an extra 5 minutes out of the workers, et cetera, et cetera. And Marx is quite clear that although that's terrible, it is not the explanation of profit. Because even if the capitalists are perfect gentlemen and don't demand a minute more from the workers than they contracted for, don't work them faster or harder than they contracted for, they still make profit. So that's not an explanation. Now, but that's not quite what you're saying, or I think that's not quite what you're saying, what Dave Schweikert is saying. What you're saying, you make it sound as though the capitalist says, I need corn and I need iron and I need labor. I need this much corn, this much iron. Who knows how much labor I need? So I'll just hire some labor and see what I can get out of them. That's not actually the way in which a capitalist works. There's a certain number of jobs, and capitalist goes to the factory door and says to the mob standing outside, all right, I'm hiring 20 people today. He doesn't say, I don't know how many people, come on in and we'll see what we can get out of you. So what exactly, I understand, mind you, it's perfectly true, and this is an important historical fact which has to be built into the full-scale story, that over time, what counts as the normal workday changes from 12 hours to 10 hours, from 10 hours to 8 hours. You know the bumper sticker, the labor movement, the people who brought the weekend to you, you know? That is, as a consequence of struggle and fighting, they fought for a 5-day week. And by doing so, they changed what over time came to be considered the expected amount. And that, so that what is ideologically encoded at one moment changes over time. That's certainly true. But you need to say more than that in order to contradict what I've said. So tell me what more you want to say.
So I guess the thought is, let's take an example, a concrete example of, like shoes, right? So given the technical means of production, given a particular technique for making a particular type of shoe, like I know technically exactly how much rubber, given a certain amount of rubber, I know exactly how many shoes I can make with that amount of rubber, right? And I know exactly how much cloth, how much leather, how many little metal grommets I need in order to properly complement that quantity.
And you know how many hours of labor you need at a certain rate or speed to do that.
Well,
now, how many people you get that amount of labor out of is not technically determined, but how many hours, that part of the technique of production involves combining all of those materials in certain ways that require a certain amount of labor.
But you said, so you gave this example from the Lucia Ball, right? Of the ways in which, and there are manifold ways in which
you speed up.
You can
sure.
Speed up production. You can extend production, and that all of those are ways of basically you can economize on labor in ways that you can't economize on materials, because you can, as it were, exploit the worker in ways that you can't exploit the materials.
That's only partially true, but I won't quibble. That is to say, there are many different ways of using the material that goes into production. And one of the kinds of innovations which are routinely introduced is finding more efficient ways of using the materials you've got. So it isn't true that it's forever given as a fact how much, but I don't think we disagree. That is to say, we're both talking about the reality of capitalism, and now the question is, how do you build that reality into the equations in such a way that you capture the mystifications which are part of capitalism? That's the question. I said the distinction between labor power and labor can't be the answer, because labor power doesn't make its appearance in the equations, and what's more, the equations can be rewritten to show that you're exploiting corn or iron or whatever. So that can't be the correct modeling. But there has to be a correct modeling, because something's really going on here, namely exploitation. Something is and something is going on that can be described, like speed-ups, like substituting children for grown-ups, like all the things that factory owners really, honest to God, do in order to increase their profits. Those are the realities of capitalism, and you have to find a way of modeling those. My argument was that Marx's way doesn't capture it successfully. Not that it doesn't happen, just that it doesn't capture it successfully. Yeah.
So I have Paul and Michal on the list. Anybody else with a hand? So Paul.
So I'm one of those philosophers who, had he come across the article, still wouldn't have been able to do the math. So I'm not sure if I entirely comprehended the whole argument. But I have just a couple.
Anybody who has successfully grappled with Kant, as far as I'm concerned, has total credibility in my eyes.
Just a couple of things are puzzling me, and I'm not sure if they have any impact on your argument at all. So one is about the assumption that the laborer, unlike the capitalist, can't cash in his capital. And it seems to me that sometimes the capitalist can't either. That is, if he's got his capital invested in a multi-story auto factory when everybody else wants single stories, or he's got his capital invested in New England knitting mills when it all moves offshore, and he doesn't get out in time, his capital just disappears.
True.
Right? So I don't know what follows from that, if anything, interesting. The other question that I had is about the assumption that the cost of labor is going to be equivalent to what it costs for the laborer to subsist, because it seems to me that may or may not be true depending upon what kind of labor is available. So if you've got a surplus army of workers, then you don't even have to pay them that much, because as soon as they die off, you can get some other ones. On the other hand, if the kind of labor you want is scarce, like 300 hitters, then you have to pay them, even though in some sense they're workers, a hell of a lot more than it costs them to subsist.
Okay, those are both good questions. The first one is easily answered. The second one is a very complicated question, which requires a vast development beyond what I've said here, and I just indicate because it's a very important question. The first question concerns the fact that there are many capitalists who get trapped in fixed capital that they have no realistic way of converting and transferring, and they write it down and they go broke, and that is well understood by the classical political economists, and it's part of what Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction, which is the way he described capitalism. And what happens is not all capitalists can transfer their capital. Some of them just go broke, and the capital gets written down and turns out just to be a pile of rusting metal. And capitalism moves on and establishes a rate of return. So that, in general, the way in which the profit rate equilibrates itself, according to the classical economists, is from the movement of capital from industry to industry over time. But it's also the case that a lot of people just get screwed. So that's true. The second point, which maybe nobody will bring up, so I want to bring it up because it's very important, is this. And if I say the name Gary Becker, some of you may recognize what I'm talking about. Marx thought, one of the several really important ways in which Marx was fundamentally wrong was in his expectation that as capitalism developed, the skills of the workers would progressively be lost, and the working class would be homogenized in a kind of mass of semi-skilled machine operators who could move easily from factory to factory, from country to country if necessary, but without accumulated skills. In fact, what we see 150 years later is this extremely steep pyramid in the working class, with some people having acquired a great deal of what Gary Becker rather evocatively calls human capital. And having that human capital, they have the ability to move the human capital from sector to sector. So Marx was wrong in his anticipation of what was going to happen in the working class, and we need a different and more complicated model to understand it. My old colleagues from UMass, Sam Bowles and Herb Gintis, from whom I learned a great deal, many years ago wrote an article in which they constructed a mathematical model of this kind of thing, which made it possible to talk about relative exploitation. That is to say, even though technically middle managers making $100,000 or $150,000 a year were being exploited by capital, the same as factory workers making $40,000 or $30,000 a year. There was also a relative exploitation going on. The middle managers were relatively exploiting those further down in the labor hierarchy, so that what you had was not a simple distinction between exploiters and exploited, but a structure of relative exploitation, which, among other things, explained the difficulty of establishing anything like worker solidarity. Since people who, not merely subjectively in, whether they go to Starbucks or not, but objectively in their relationship to the system of production, occupy different and somewhat antagonistic positions, cannot be expected to form a solidarity and work together. So that a full-scale analysis or reanalysis of Marx's critique of capitalism would require not just the simple equations that I constructed in that essay in order to prove a point, but would require a really full-scale development of an analysis of the sort that many people work on and are interested in trying to understand why it is that you get working class men who have been left behind for 30 years in wages supporting Donald Trump, for example, and so forth. I mean, you need a much more complicated analysis than anything I suggested in this. So the answer to your question is you're right. And your intuitions about this are spot on. The first I'm not concerned about, because that's just part of the ongoing development of capitalism. The second requires a really elaborate theoretical development.
I'm going to put myself on the cue here. So I wanted to go back a bit to the discussion you had with Dave about the sense in which capitalism relies on a certain kind of mystification, and then the sense in which it would matter to dispel that mystification. I'm sure that would be one of them. So one reason why it might matter that capitalism rely on these mystifications would be, well, once the workers stop believing it, then they might engage in some collective action because, to overthrow it. And that seemed to possibly be part of the exchange.
Well, to put it more precisely, their ceasing to believe in it would be a part of it. It's not once then. It is a part of their,
but certainly ceasing to believe something
is a part of their working to change it.
Because capitalism seeing mystifying would contribute to them engaging in collective action that would lead to the overthrow of capitalism. But then it was a little bit unclear in that conversation what it is that they believe, that stopping believing it would sort of contribute to their desire to overthrow capitalism. And one answer you gave was that Marx is not a moralist. He isn't interested in morality in general.
Well, he isn't a moralist. He's an Old Testament prophet.
So that gets my question. Because another way of reading this would be that it's called a critique of political economy. He's not writing it for workers at all. He's writing against political economists whose main intention was to show capitalism is a rational way of organizing for the production of surplus and distribute it. And it's rational not just in that it says what it does, but it does it without prices. It does it in a way that will normally reproduce itself. And instead, the point about the irrationality of the system and all its mystification is not that it stabilizes itself by convincing workers of things that aren't true, but rather, actually, by showing that the system is just irrational, it's self-canceling. This is a view Marxists used to have. But what he's trying to show then, in the way in which irony is supposed to function as part of the social analysis, is that, but where your modification of his theory of exploitation might be a problem, is if it really works the way he says it does, he seems to think it generates two things: crises, periodic economic crises, not permanent growth, but permanent economic crises, and the creation of people who will, for some not entirely clearly defined reason, just automatically change it. At some point, it's going to generate these crises at such scale and magnitude.
Not automatically.
So I'm just wondering. So this would be an alternative reading of Marx and his anti-moralism, because it might, and I'm presenting as an alternative. It's not what I happen to believe, but it has been said of Marx in a way of explaining his anti-moralism.
is he doesn't think that dispelling the subjective beliefs some people hold matters, because all he's seeking to demonstrate is this thing isn't going to be able to reproduce itself in a rational way. It's just going to produce crises, and eventually, and dig its own grave, as he says. It will create the people who end up, for, again, not entirely clear reasons, when there's a crisis, come along and make it more rational or something like that.
Yeah.
But then the point of the kind of ironic dimensions, all of this sort of the literary structure, is to say, not just that he's explain where exploitation comes from, and not just to say that we engage in these sort of crazy things where we relate to our work not for its intrinsic benefits, but by calculating what's going to earn the highest wage. But then when each one of us gets good at doing that, what's going to happen is not a rational distribution of resources, but it's going to produce a crisis. It's actually not reproducible. It's not able to reproduce itself socially. So that might make sense of the thing, but then it puts the whole, puts the theory on a different footing and is a different kind of answer to today. It doesn't matter whether people are outraged or not, because the system itself, if properly understood, is just going to, it is itself irrational and will produce economic crisis and therefore will sort of, whatever, not operate the way it
Just chime in, because that account wouldn't make any use or any appeal to the fact that anybody's demystified. That's not playing any role in that account.
Right.
I mean, sorry, mystified and then demystified. That plays no role.
Exactly.
He's just trying to debunk some economic theory or something.
Yeah, and specifically he's demystifying.
It's very different from Professor.
Right, so that's why I'm presenting is it seems like a very different kind of argument. But the reason it would matter is it would matter a lot then that his theory of exploitation be the one he says, because his crisis theory rests on that stuff as well. So a lot of what else is irrational.
All right, there's a lot to say. First of all, we have to keep firmly in mind that Marx actually wrote this book, and he wrote it the way he wrote it. And it sounds to me as though, if you're correct, it's a total mystery in a non-mystifying way, just a totally incomprehensible why he would choose to write the book that way, except as a jeu d'esprit. Why bother to do that? Why not lay out the theory of crisis in the clearest Ricardian terms possible? And that isn't what he chose to do. And I think he didn't choose to do that because he had reasons. Okay, first of all, Marx, to put it as simple-mindedly as possible, Marx makes 3 predictions. And his expectation that socialism is going to succeed capitalism rests on the correctness of those 3 predictions. It's why in my paper, The Future of Socialism, which is available on bots.net, and which you'll be excited to learn, rests on certain things I learned from the theory of financial cost accounting. I mean, if you do this stuff, you got to go in weird places. It's why, it's why midway through I had a section called Why Aren't We Having Fun Yet? The 3 predictions are, 1, the workers are going to get more and more miserable. 2, the economy is going to crash. And 3, by the time the economy crashes, the workers will have figured out what the hell is going on in such a way that they can take advantage of the crash to bring about not just chaos, but socialism. If those 3 predictions are not correct, then Marx is wrong. Now that's, in philosophy, one of the really great things about philosophy is that almost nothing you say can be falsified, which means that you can keep going for millennia saying the same things, and that counts as a tradition. In this stuff, if you make predictions and they turn out to be false, you got to change your theory. It looked as though he was right about the crash because it came. What happened when the crash came, he didn't anticipate, which was that capitalists would get together and figure out how to ride it out. He didn't predict Keynes and Roosevelt, to put it simple-mindedly in American terms. He didn't predict that capitalists would work out. Now, when I was young, we used to refer to the present stage of capitalism as late capitalism. That was an optimistic thing to say when I was young. Now it's kind of a sad joke. Late capitalism, thank you very much. And there are true believers who say, we just have to wait a little bit longer. That was just the first of several crashes before the really big crash when we get socialism. Well, maybe not. But a key part of this, it doesn't happen automatically. It doesn't happen regardless of what workers think. The key part of this is that millions upon millions of people get mobilized, they get their consciousness raised, they understand better what the hell's going on, and they join together and act in coherent ways. And that requires, to put it trivially, demystification. It requires that they see through the makers and takers story. They see through the nonsense of neoclassical economics, the marginal productivity nonsense of neoclassical economics. They may even have to learn a little bit about Euler's theorem in order to understand why it is that all the talk about marginal productivity is irrelevant to the reality of capitalism. They need all of that. They need to understand, they need things like Occupy Wall Street, which gave to America the term the 1%. People talk as though Occupy Wall Street was a great failure, but in fact it was an astonishing success, given how much it accomplished for very little effort when it comes right down to it, when you're talking about an economy of 308 million people, $16 trillion a year. But what's needed, along with everything else, is to penetrate these mysteries, to understand what's really going on, to connect that up with action, and then also to connect it up with economic crises when they come so that you can act and do something to change the world. It doesn't happen automatically, and it won't happen if the crisis comes and nobody understands what the hell's going on. You'll just get bad times until capitalists figure out how to get back to making money, which is what they did after the crash in 2008. They finally figured out how to use the government to bail them out and then get back to making more money. But it didn't change anything, or not yet. There's some signs that things are changing, but that's just because I'm an optimist. In this world of Tiggers and Eeyores, I'm a Tigger, so I tend always to be optimistic, but I may just be getting old and desperate.
I've got some follow-up questions about that, but I want to make sure to get everyone. So I've got Nicole and then Corey.
Thank you. So I was wondering if you could elaborate more on the what I take to be a fictitious relationship between the body and capital, and specifically the body as capital. And part of the question is, what is fictitious about it? Is it that human nature just gets lost, that we don't treat people like people are when we think of bodies as capital? Or is the claim that one kind of within capitalism, that bodies are false capital because they don't generate profit? So the worker can only think of her body as capital if she kind of gets it wrong and doesn't recognize that capital is not just any commodity, it's a commodity that generates profit, right?
Well, capital is not a commodity, but let's use the terms correctly. But yes, the body is not capital at all in a capitalist system, but it's treated as though it were. There's something deeper going on, and this is one of the ways in which the early stuff that Marx wrote is really quite illuminating. Just since I try never to give a talk without citing the Bible, let me go back to Genesis. You all recall what happens in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve disobey God. They are driven out of the Garden of Eden, and God lays a curse upon them. Upon Adam, he lays the curse that henceforth you will get your bread by the sweat of your brow. That will be your labor. And upon Eve, he lays the curse that she will bring forth children in pain and sorrow. And that's why birth is called labor. And this establishes, as it were, in literary terms, the long tradition in Western civilization that labor is a disvalue, that it is something bad, that it's something that is imposed upon you, not activity. Activity is good, as Aristotle says, but labor is bad. And it's what the lower classes are forced to do because they're evil, because they suffer from original sin, because they're poor, whatever. Marx offers what might be called the romantic artist's version, revision of this notion, according to which productive labor is a form of creation, but it's collective creation. It's collective creation, it's externalization. Now, this is a long and complicated and ambivalent subject because this self-externalization, when an artist creates an art object, say a painter paints a painting, the painting, which started out as an idea in the artist's mind, is now externalized in the form of the paint on the canvas, at which point the artist loses control over it. An art lover buys it, and perhaps the art lover hangs it in his toilet because he thinks that's a nice place to hang a Van Gogh, whereas it would kill Van Gogh to think that one of his paintings was hanging in a toilet. And so what started out as a self-externalization that was a fulfillment now becomes an external object that stands over against the artist and may even oppress the artist. And that's exactly what happens with capital in a capitalist system. But labor, Marx thinks, is, when done properly, when done in a human way, is a positive act. It is something that we value. It is not just something that produces things that have value. The activity itself is valuable. It is a human activity. What happens in capitalism is that all of that gets distorted and transformed by, first of all, the transformation of the labor act itself, and then by the alienation of the product. That is to say, alienation in law means transferring ownership of. So transferring ownership of is also at the same time setting over against oneself. That's why the word Gegenstand is such an evocative word, something that stands over against you, an object, something that's thrown over against you. But in a truly human world, this activity would be a fulfillment, not a curse laid upon us by God for our sins or whatever. And it is treated as a curse. I mean, I can't resist. Have you ever seen the old movie I'm All Right, Jack, with Peter Sellers? It's a movie about a communist labor leader who's working who organizes the workers in a factory. And I mean, it's got Ian Richardson in it doing a wonderful comic turn and all sorts of funny stuff. But in the factory, there are some men who have been declared superfluous, but the union has demanded that they be kept on. So they spend every day sitting behind a stack of pallets playing cards. But they get paid for it because the union was strong enough so that they didn't get laid off. Well, one day, Peter Sellers calls a strike, and everybody marches off the factory. These guys behind the pallets at first don't realize there's a strike, but then they notice that everybody's marching away, and they throw their cards down and march off themselves, and the only assumption you can make is they're going to go home and play cards. And this is why Marx says that in capitalism, when the worker is at work, he's not at home, and when he's at home, he's not at work. You remember that famous passage from the Economic Philosophic Manuscripts? Because work is seen as a curse rather than as a fulfillment. And part of that is the ideological treatment of the body itself as a form of capital owned by the worker, owned, as it were, by the Cartesian soul inside the Cartesian body, which the Cartesian soul owns and uses to sell in the marketplace. Does that answer anything that...
Yes, but I guess the question is, are we faced with two different lies then about the body as capital? One of them is that the activity of the body is falsely understood as this burden thing. When we truly understand it, we see it as something that is free or expressive.
That could be.
Yeah, so that's lie number one. And then is there a second lie about how capitalism shapes the body as capital, or the image of the body as capital, even though the body doesn't generate profit?
Yes.
So
Yes.
Two lies.
Yes. Yeah. If I could read you a passage, I think I've actually got it here. I brought this damn thing. I might as well use it. Let's see. Yeah, here it is. I don't know whether anybody can see it. It starts at the bottom of that page. The consumption of labor power is completed, as in the case of every other commodity, outside the limits of the market or of the sphere of circulation. Accompanied by Mr. Moneybags and by the possessor of labor power, the worker, we therefore take leave for a time of this noisy sphere where everything takes place in the surface and in view of all men, and follow them both into the hidden abode of production, on whose threshold there stares us in the face no admittance except on business. Here we shall see, you understand that that is an echo of Dante. Here we shall see not only how capital produces, but how capital is produced. We shall at last force the secret of profit-making. This sphere that we are deserting, within whose boundaries the sale and purchase of labor power goes on, is in fact the very Eden of the innate rights of man. There alone rule freedom, equality, property, and Bentham. Freedom because both buyer and seller of a commodity, say of labor power, are constrained, etc. I won't read the whole thing, you can read it. But it's this wonderful description of this contrast. I have to say one thing about this, even though it'll take me a minute or two. One of the, perhaps the central distinction in all of philosophy is the distinction between appearance and reality. And the greatest image of the distinction between appearance and reality, as many of you know, is the allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic. And you remember the allegory of the cave. I don't have to repeat what it is. This is the inversion of that. This is the inversion of that. Marx says, the sunlit marketplace out from the cave under the sun is the realm of mystification and appearance. It is in the factory where the workers are chained to the machines. That's the reality of capitalism. And by taking this dominant image of the distinction between appearance and reality and inverting it in this dramatic way, he is calling attention to the fundamental mystification of capitalism. It's a great literary turn, and it makes me tear up every time I talk about it, because it is one of the most powerful images in all of philosophy, and Marx has brilliantly turned it upside down in that passage.
Cool. Yeah. Okay, thanks for this. And I wanted to go back to the exchange with Dave, where Dave is arguing that really at the moment where you understand the labor theory of value, you need a second value-based argument to make the leap that Marx is making, as opposed to the traditional Marxist your view, which is no, there's something actually about the knowing, apart from the value argument and moral reasoning, that leads you towards the conclusion that there's something fundamentally problematic, as I take it also towards the idea of solidarity too. So when you think yourself into the person who is taught the labor theory of value for the first time and realizes that they're exploited, I guess I can see that first move of thinking, well, there's something wrong here, but only because you're within the framework of the bourgeois property owner, right? You've been taught this framework that I own, I deserve, and now you see, actually, he doesn't deserve or own, you should deserve or own. So that within the bourgeois framework teaches you that, and that's the value that's, I think, behind the reaction that you're describing, that there's something wrong here. But I guess I think that's very far from the conclusion that solidarity and all the things that you want are the
Well,
right
sure it
thing.
is. I mean,
to the contrary, it seems to just reinforce, right, the bourgeois ethic. And you might think, well, I want to be an owner, or I want, more private property, or I'm entitled to more of a fair share. But it doesn't seem at all to lead to the thing that you want or that Marx wants, which is the completely different set of values from private property to solidarity.
well, lead.
Without further argument and,
Well, remember, it isn't the case. I mean, this is the point of the last thesis on Feuerbach. It isn't the case that if somebody would just write the right book, that would be the end of capitalism. Well, Marx wrote the right book. He wrote it 150 years ago, and we still have capitalism. Writing the right book is not, it's an important part. I mean, I gave a talk at Hampshire College once, many, many years ago. I don't know, 40 years ago, whenever it was. I've lived so long, I can't remember anymore. And I was going on about this kind of stuff, and a kid asked, he raised his hand and he said, so if you believe that, why do you write books? And I said, because it's what I do. I mean, we need a lot of people doing a lot of different things. We need people picketing, we need people handing out flyers, we need people running guns. Well, no, maybe not running guns. We need people writing books, we need people doing all sorts of things. Writing books is not the most important thing. It just happens to be what I'm good at, so I do it. But
I guess what I'm saying is that it is writing books that's going to solve the problem. It's just that there are two books. One is the theory of the theory of value, which is an unmasking, which will cause discomfort about the consistency of the current values with the existing system. And I think it gives a dissonance to it. But it keeps you trapped within the existing set of morality. If you want this second thing, which is the solidarity theory, that's a separate book. That's a book that says, actually, even though you might be disquieted or think that you are owed more than receiving, the natural reactions to seeing the disjunction between the private property theory and the current circumstances. If you want to escape that and enter this new realm of solidarity, that's actually a different value system. And that isn't something that comes from natural processes.
It's not clear to me.
It's not a private property system. It's not the I'm being ripped off. You wouldn't say that. You would say, I want to see my solidarity with the working class.
Yeah, I mean, sure, that's true. And in fact, Marx wrote some of those books. I mean, there's a lot that has to be written, a lot that has to be said, because it's an enormous task. It's not just one thing. This is just about what's happening in certain parts of this book, but there are other parts of this book, like the great chapter on the working day, and the even longer chapter on machinery and modern industry, which together make up a third of the whole book, in which he's not doing this kind of stuff about mystification. He's talking in the most detailed way about what goes on in the factory and about stages in the development from manufacture to factory work and so forth.
I guess just the last point, I don't think any of that gets you the point that you want, which is the move to a different set of values, aside from actually stating what the values are and making the argument for it.
I don't see that it has to do with values. It has to do with people getting off their asses and doing something, which is what Marx tried to do with the First International. I mean, it requires a whole lot of stuff. I think of social change not as brain surgery, where you have to make precisely the right move, and if you make a slightly different move, whoops, you've got somebody who's paralyzed for life. I think of it as sort of like a landslide. Things are rushing down a hillside, and there's an enormous boulder, and that's Fannie Lou Hamer, and there's another enormous tree, and that's Martin Luther King, and there's a pebble, and that's Bob Wolff. But what's important is that you're rolling down the right side of the hill, and that there's a lot of pebbles along with a lot of trees and boulders and bushes all coming, and when you're done, the whole side of the hill will have been reshaped by that landslide. And all of that is needed. This is only a part of it. I mean, it's, and it's only a part. I don't mean it's a part, but now this is all we need to talk about. It's all of those things. But I resist the notion that it's a different value system. I mean, I suppose in some broad enough sense it is a different value system, but it's not an argument in ethical theory. It's a set of actions that are going to make a difference. You'll leave the ethicists afterward to clean up after us and to figure out what the hell to say about it. What's needed is actions.
Well, on the note of the ethicists cleaning up afterwards, I think Dave had a
Unless anybody else who hasn't had a chance wants to this point. I had a question about the literary and rhetorical stuff. So, a lot hangs on the claim that capitalist society is objectively mystified, and I like that idea. So there's a discourse that's mystifying, and the idea, which we've been querying a little bit, is that it depends on people, the participants, operating in that conceptual scheme, something like that. So that's functional for it or whatever. And we've been asking about whether that's true or why it's true, but suppose that's true. And then I was wondering, we're trying to explain why Marx writes in a certain way. Now, if capitalism is objectively mystified by that discourse, call it bourgeois discourse, then he's going to have to at least mention those terms. He's going to have to say, here's how people see things, here's how people have to see things. So far, we don't have even him having to use those terms, but mention them, so to speak. Here's what people say about this, here's how they have to say these things about that.
Yeah, he does that.
So one question is why he would even have to himself, in his own voice, use those bourgeois concepts. But there's a second question. seems like a lot of what you're trying to explain goes way beyond the bourgeois discourse into biblical references and literary allusion and metaphor and irony and all that. And that isn't explained yet. I don't see how yet that would be explained by the fact that a certain discourse, bourgeois discourse, is objectively mystifying and needs to be talked about in a scientific conception. So really, there's two questions. Suppose you have to use the bourgeois concepts to understand the way people understand their world, but you do it as a scientist. You're mentioning them, not using them. And even so, that wouldn't get us to the stuff about metaphor, irony, the Bible, and all that. So
I think, yeah, it's a good question. I think the reason, and I tried to explain that in my paper with the example about the former Catholic. You remember that? Well,
Catholic versus the atheist?
the Catholic who says, I'm no longer Catholic.
right, yeah.
And how he...
You answer in a way that they can tell.
The point is that Marx seeks to anatomize capitalism from within capitalism. Not, this is actually a long and complicated discussion which I talk about in these lectures I put on YouTube about, among other things, ethnography. It's a long subject, but not as an anthropologist describing some tribe, but as, well, but as somebody talking about his or her own world, a world that Marx himself is embedded in, was brought up in. I'll tell you a story. I always tell stories. When I taught at the University of Chicago from 61 to 63, I taught in this sophomore survey course. And once or twice a year, we had guest lecture. It was taught in sections, but once or twice a year, we all got together into a big lecture hall, and somebody gave a guest lecture. And one of the guest lectures was a brilliant lecture by an anthropologist. This was a guy who had taken a group of his students on what used to be called a pub crawl of the near north side of Chicago. That is, he took them to a series of bars and pubs and so forth in the near north. These were all bars that the students at Chicago had been to, the students in the audience had been to. But he got these students to describe what they saw using the language of ethnography, the language of anthropology. And the fascinating thing was that when you described what went on in these bars using the language of ethnography, kinship structure and all that stuff, it didn't sound anything to these students like the experience they'd had when they'd gone to these bars. And after a while, it dawned on them, maybe the anthropological descriptions that they read in anthropology texts of the sort that they were reading in our course don't sound at all like the societies of the people they're describing to the people in those societies. Maybe Trobriand Islanders reading the descriptions of the Trobriand Islands written by whoever it was, Malinowski, wouldn't recognize themselves in those descriptions, and maybe, therefore, those descriptions are in some fundamental way wrong. Well, Marx is embedded in this bourgeois capitalist society as well as anatomizing it, and he needs to find a way from within to call it into question while simultaneously acknowledging that he and everyone else is captured by it. That he's simultaneously...
Within it, that would just be using the bourgeois concept.
Yes, but he is...
would all be familiar, they wouldn't see in literary...
Yes, but he needs to break away from it while also not break away from it by writing as though he had never been a part of it, not break away from it by writing as though he was visiting from a foreign planet and describing the curious creatures that lived on that planet, but describing it as somebody who had freed himself from it. Well, to take the allegory of the cave and bring it up to date, those people trapped in the cave see the flickering images on the wall of the cave. And some of the smartest of them notice that they can actually predict the images as they go by. And after a while, they get very good at it. And some of them get so good at it that they can make a living predicting those images. And some of them are so good that they're even given a prize for being able to predict those images. They have a name for themselves. They call themselves macroeconomists. And they're very good at predicting those images. And one of the people trapped in that cave manages to free himself and work his way up and see what the world is really like. And when he comes back, they won't listen to him, and they even forget his name. And so years later, they won't even mention his name. People like Paul Krugman can't bring themselves to mention his name. And his name was, of course, Karl Marx. I mean, what we see in modern economic theory is precisely that kind of unironic acceptance of the flickering of the images. And what we need to do is, for our world, is what Marx did for his world, which is to find some way from within it to call those images into question. And that's part of what I'm trying to get people to do by showing them what Marx does. I mean, it's not just, otherwise what you have is endless Paul Krugmans, and which is not the same thing as change.
Is there anyone else? One last follow-up. We've got time for one more question. So if there's no one else who has a question, I'll ask one. Because it's on this. It's sort of like, so here's one thing you say in Moneybags and in this paper, which is that the reason we need an ironic structure to the analysis of society is it's the only way to grasp the reality of capitalist society, or at least the reason Marx needs it. Because what's crazy about it, at least what you said today has been sounded a little slightly different than what I thought you said written is. What's crazy about it is that just to get along in this society, we have to relate to our labor and to things by abstracting from any of their particular characteristics and thinking about them as values. And that's required just to get along in capitalism, because that's how capitalism works. But we also have to grasp that that's a crazy thing to do. So it's not false. So in one sense, in a really important way, it's not false that capitalism works by producing and exchanging values. So it's the appearance reality metaphor that we've been using is actually seems slightly different than what Marx is saying. Marx is saying he also says things appear as they really are. It really is the case that to get along in capitalism, I have to think about not sort of the most rewarding
That's
of my
why
labor personally. I have to think about, well, where could I get paid the best?
That's
and
what Marx
I
says.
look at a piece of art not for its beauty, but for its value, and everything becomes a value. So
He says it's verrückt, but it's socially valid.
Right, but so now what matters here is not changing, but so now it looks like it's the only way in which we change, there isn't really now a big distinction between, and it's not really even about people's thoughts about the fairness of the society. It's that the only way to change the way people need to think is by just changing that society, right? It's until you've changed that society, there's no way to get along in it except by thinking in this slightly verboten way, right? Just to get up in the morning and to go get about and then even pay something for something, I have to perform that kind of crazy calculation. So it's not false.
No,
it's no longer. So to say what he's done is shown how that's all false, and here's the reality, seems a little bit not. So the point then of the ironic.
Something's got to be false here, or it's not crazy.
What's false are some of the predictions that bourgeois political economy makes on the basis of this, right? This is why. So bourgeois political comes out. Well, it must be rational, so I'm going to figure out how it's rational, or it must be something. But what matters maybe are some of the empirical predictions. For instance, that this actually leads to crisis rather than something else, or that this is based on justice. When in the end, I think he just wants to show it's just based on force. That's his anti-moralism. I think he thinks it's just a way of licensing force or something like that. But just in terms of the ironic structure aspect, it's not as if what he's trying to do is it's demystifying the following sense. This is how we think it appears to us, when in fact it works this other way. It's rather
false.
What's that?
Something's false there.
Something. So there might be something that's false,
right.
But that's different from saying it's sort of crazy, right? I think he thinks there might be something really crazy about organizing our economic life this way. And to get that it's crazy, we need to have some sense of its craziness. But that doesn't mean it's false in the sense it's not really how the society works. It really is true the society works by engaging
But of course,
in
I mean, but that's just what Marx says, and that's what I say. I agree completely. Of course, that is. Look, an insane asylum really is a collection of crazy people, and that's the way they function. Crazy. They really do. They're not sane people who are pretending to be crazy for some odd reason. They're really crazy. The whole society is crazy. And it really functions that way. And in order to get along in it, you have to turn yourself into a crazy person. And you have to undermine what is most natural and most human about yourself, because that's the way you get a job and keep a job, that's the way you make a profit. I mean, that is, as Marx says, it's verrückt, but it's crack-brained, but it's socially valid, because it works in a narrow sense. But it doesn't work, he claims. Why? Because people are going to be made miserable by it, and because witness the rise in suicides and deaths of non-college educated white men whose world is falling apart, the well-known, recently documented fact about American society, and because you have economic crises. If you don't have economic crises, that is, Marx really is making predictions which could turn out to be false. They're real predictions. They might turn out to be wrong. And if they turn out to be wrong, then he is wrong. I mean, you don't save it by saying, well, we're talking ethics or something. He's making predictions which could turn out to be true and could turn out to be false. Some of them turn out to be true, some of them turn out to be false, and some are a little more complicated than that. But he really is making predictions. And we have to change our predictions if the ones that he makes turn out not to work.
Well, please join me.